It's really an honor to be here considering how much SketchUp has influenced my work over the years. It was the first modeler I ever used in school. It's the modeler I use every day today. So I just want to thank the SketchUp team for inviting me here to come talk today. As Mark said, I created the website Visualizing Architecture, which is a website that focuses on architecture graphics. So it covers quite a bit of stuff. It goes from diagrammatic images to abstract images to photoreal images to portfolio design to layout design. And then from that, I take that information and then I try to distill it down into some tutorials, and I try to just explain how these images are created. So today I want to talk about what drives my work and why I create the images that I create. If you've ever been to my website, you'll find that it's kind of all over the place stylistically. If you were to ask me, what's the style I prefer, what do I see, what style do I think defines me, I don't think I can answer that question because I'm constantly trying to explore and test out new ideas and see, what else is out there, trying to find new inspiration, trying to push myself every image I make. So there's not really one style that I prefer, but there is a thread that sort of connects all these images together, and it's the fact that I use a very heavy Photoshop workflow. But to explain why I use a heavy Photoshop workflow, I need to step back and kind of talk about where I came from in my background. So growing up, I did a lot of drawing as a kid. And I did a lot of people, a lot of faces. I gravitated towards this for some reason. It was difficult to do, but it taught me a lot about proportion and light and texture. These are some other ones that I did. So then once I got into school, into architecture school, I naturally just kind of continued to hand draft everything. The problem with that was my classmates started to run circles around me because they were going into 3D software and they were able to create much more complex designs, and they were able to iterate much faster, and they were able to make changes and edits much faster. And so I realized I couldn't just keep doing this forever. I had to go into the computer at some point. And honestly, I was the last one in my class to get a laptop and start, going into that. So I went right into SketchUp. It was a pretty obvious choice because SketchUp was so intuitive, and in terms of barrier to entry, it was just much easier to do than most software. The problem with SketchUp, and I'm not knocking SketchUp, but when it came to presentation time, this was the first rendering I ever did digitally that I presented in a class, and it was just lacking some emotion. It just wasn't the type of work I was used to presenting from the hand-drafted stuff. It was just because I was really uncomfortable with the computer. I just really didn't know anything about rendering or Photoshop or anything. So I start going online and I start trying to find whatever tutorial I can. And I'm not knocking on V-Ray here either, but this is the kind of stuff I was finding online, and it was just such a paradigm shift for me to go from drawing pencil and paper to going into the computer and adjusting numbers and letting something render out overnight, and hopefully when I come back in the morning, it was looking good. So this just didn't work with me. So I actually went onto graphic design websites and started learning Photoshop through these sites. And they weren't, creating tutorials through the lens of architecture. They were just creating tutorials on everything, and I just kind of burned through anything I could find, looking, how to control light through Photoshop, how to control textures through Photoshop. And what this meant was I didn't have to rely so much on the 3D programs and rendering programs. And what I mean by that is I didn't have to have these big elaborate models built. I didn't have to have, just this detailed model, all the textures figured out, I could get away with more abstract designs and then go into Photoshop. And as a student, that's kind of what you need. You don't have the time to develop all these, beautiful models. You have to kick stuff out, and a lot of times stuff is still very conceptual. So I went more towards the Photoshop-based workflows. So like I said before, my styles are kind of all over the place, but I'm going to attempt to describe that there's actually an evolution to the work on my site that has happened over time. And one of the most important things when I was first getting into the digital world is how can I give the images more of a human touch. So this is the first project I'm going to talk about. This is clay model rendering. So a long time ago I was using Keynote. I don't use that anymore. I use V-Ray for everything. And these clay models, you literally just bring in the SketchUp model into Keynote, do a material override, and kick this out, and it takes a few minutes. So you really didn't need to have any knowledge to do this. But then what I did is I started to go online and I started to just find textures wherever I could. I even scanned in some of my own sketchy textures, but I was just trying to find all these sketchy textures that I was used to growing up. And then I'd take that and I'd start to overlay those onto that clay model. Again, kind of going off of what I knew from growing up and just starting to embed these textures in. What I ended up with was an image that looked less generated by a computer and something that was more generated by a person. And some of the things I learned from this was this idea of imperfection. I actually went in and added smudges, like the same kind of imperfections that you get from hand drawing. I went in and added those to this image. And it's not like I'm trying to be dishonest with this image. It was more of me trying to understand how this new medium worked, like me just getting used to the technology. So I was trying to create images that I was more used to visually. And these are some other images, again, using the exact same workflow. This is another example. I was just playing around with the smudge tool, and using the smudge tool you can actually start to create a painted look. And then also, since I wasn't using rendering programs, how could I manage light a little better in Photoshop? So this is just a straight up SketchUp export. And then I duplicate that layer, darken it, give it a blue tint, and then start to erase away that image to reveal the lighter image below. And after a little time, you can actually create this illusion of a night scene just through Photoshop. And then I started to look for inspiration elsewhere. So this is called Quilling. It's where you take strips of paper and you curl it and you create these designs. And I realized you could recreate this pretty easily digitally using SketchUp. So I took one of my models and exported it as a 2D graphic CAD drawing, then brought that back into SketchUp, found a plugin, one of the hundreds of plugins, and I just extruded all the line work at once to create this effect of strips of paper. And then I just threw it into Keynote, did a clay model rendering, and then went into Photoshop and kind of Photoshopped it on top. And again, just trying to kind of recreate some of these images that I was seeing online. And this is another one, that same technique. And then, as a kid, I always looked through car and driver magazines. I'd always come across these images that it was this illustrator would take a car and he would create an X-ray illusion of what was happening on the inside. And I always found these images so engaging to look at because it really shows the relationship of what's happening on the exterior skin and versus what's happening on the inside. And it's an understanding that you just don't get with sections and elevations. So I started to wonder, how could you recreate that with architecture? So I took a SketchUp model and I started to do some renderings. In each rendering, I'd peel away another piece of the building. Nowadays, as you build a SketchUp model, just if you group it carefully, this is a pretty easy thing to do. So I did all three of these renderings, and then I brought them into Photoshop and just started to overlay them on top of each other and erase away. What I ended up with was a X-ray rendering of a building. And I'm not sure why this type of stuff isn't done more, because I feel like this really tells a good story of how a building tectonically works and how the exterior skins relate to what's happening inside the building. This is another example. This is my thesis project. I actually didn't do this during my thesis. I did this image a couple of years later, but I wish I would have had something like this to present, because a lot of people, the form of the building was kind of crazy, and a lot of people were not quite sure what was driving the form, and I wish I could have had this to kind of show how the form was relating to the what's happening inside the building. This is one more. This is just another iteration on that, where I'm bringing in section cuts into the building. So then after that, I started to look at, abstracting images, not trying to slowly move towards photoreal, but instead, what can visualization do? So this was a clay model rendering that I brought into Photoshop and started to overlay some colors and textures. And the concept behind this project was this idea of shifting grids. So I brought in all this line work, and it's kind of reflecting the shifting grids. Then I went online and found the texture, kind of played with that, duplicated it and shifted it, again playing off of the shifting grids, and then overlaid that on top. And then I created this image, and it really wasn't that much work to create this, but if you use Photoshop smartly, you can start to build in complexity with not a lot of work. This was another image from that project, again using the exact same workflows. And then just another abstract image. This is just straight up SketchUp line work exports and shadows, bringing it in to Photoshop and just playing with colors. What could I do with just a bare minimum amount of information? So then I get into closer to the kind of work I'm doing today. So this is a project that I just made up for my website, and it's a very basic rendering. I modeled all the context, just threw in some basic textures. And then I started to go online, and similar to what I did with my sketch example I showed earlier, I went online and started to find textures because I wanted to turn this into a snow scene somehow. So I went online and just started collecting all these textures that I knew I would need. Took those textures and then overlaid them onto the ground to create kind of the snowy feel. Same with the roof. I found some images of a snowy roof, threw those on, desaturated the image, and so I was starting to get a little closer to the snowy scene I was going for. And then there's this guy was probably one of my bigger influences growing up. I watched every episode of this guy, and I even bought his kit and tried to do all the same pages. But one thing Bob Ross always did was he always played up this idea of depth. And he would, start with the mountains in the background, and then he would start painting in the trees really lightly, and I'd be yelling at the TV, like, why are you doing that so lightly? That doesn't make sense. And then as he gets closer to the canvas, stuff starts to get darker, and then it all makes sense. And he was a master at managing, depth in an image. So I tried to take kind of that stuff that I learned from Bob Ross and apply that to my images. So with that snowy scene that was over here, I brought in a bunch of fog and, it's all done in Photoshop, just painting it in slowly and slowly layering it on, kind of like Bob Ross talked about, and the stuff in the distance gets a little more foggier. And then from there, I went into Photoshop and painted in some light. And then finally, just did some color tweaks, added in some people, added in some lights in the trees. But again, it's a very Photoshop-heavy workflow, but drawing back on some of the stuff that I learned early on from those graphic design websites. This is another example where I'm taking a pretty well-developed image. So I have this daylight rendering. I already P-shopped this, but I want to turn this into a night scene. So using the same technique that I showed earlier about duplicating the layer and then darkening it, I'm doing the same thing here. So I'm taking that image, darkening it, and then erasing it away to reveal some of the daylight images underneath. And then from there I go into just coloring it in Photoshop, P-shopping in a wet ground and adding the entourage. And in a few amount of steps you create a really dramatic image just through Photoshop. This is another project I did recently. So I built a decently elaborate 3D model, but I do anything with the site. So this is sited on Iceland Cliff. So this was the last image of my project. I wanted to create something that was really dramatic and just kind of a way to like stamp the end of the project. So I wanted to do this aerial image, but I didn't really have a lot to work with. So I did a quick V-Ray rendering, threw in some lights, and so this is my base of what I was going to start with. Then I went online and just started finding images wherever I could, just collecting. Whether I knew I was going to use it or not, I was just trying to collect my images. Then I went into Photoshop and just started to piece this stuff in and stitch it together. So like the cliff at the bottom, that's made up of 3 different images. The ocean waves are different from the ocean that's kind of receding off into the background. And then after a while, I got it to this point, but it still looks heavily stitched. The architecture doesn't really fit in with the context. So then I went in and just tweaked the coloring, tweaked the lighting, did my Bob Ross fog effects and all that, and ended up with a pretty dramatic image. Other things I like to do on the website is just talk about portfolio development. This is some of my favorite stuff to do. So this is taking all these different styles and ideas and how can you start to tell a story through them, taking such completely different rendering styles, piecing them together, getting them to feel like they belong in a single project. And then also, just basic ideas of, when you're developing a portfolio, don't just take the first idea of a spread that you get. Don't just take the first or second idea that you get. Don't take the first 4 ideas that you come up with. But like really experiment with, what's the best way to lay this out until you get to that spread that just works and tells the story like you want it to. And then something else that I do on my website is I basically, the first few years, I burned through all the projects that I did in school, kind of breaking them down and explaining them. So about 2 or 3 years ago, I had to start just coming up with projects out of the blue. So I make up these projects, and they're usually from areas that I live by. So this is a project I designed. It's called Boston Wharf. And again, I'm just exploring with all these different styles and how can I start to tell the story of this project through a portfolio of spreads. This is the Boston Culture Center. This is again in Boston, more spreads. And then this is my hometown of Deschler, Ohio, where I grew up before I moved to Boston, another project I just designed in there. But each one of these spreads, not only are the illustration styles different, but then, just the feel of each one is different from the other, but then how can I connect them through colors or, different ideas. And then the cliff retreat that I just finished up not too long ago. So the professional life, so it's all fun and games, doing this on my own time, but I actually moved out to Boston 6 years ago to work for an architecture firm, and then about 2 years ago I left that, and me and my partner Andrew, we started up our own illustration company, and we do quite a range of work. So about half of our work is in Boston, and then the other half are for architects around the country. We do everything from huge scale master planning projects in Masdar to little tiny, courtyard areas in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We do quite a bit of range. But the nice thing is we're still using the same general workflow that I use on my website. We use V-Ray, SketchUp, and Photoshop. And again, like most of our clients, they're sending us project files either in SketchUp or Revit. So it makes a lot of sense to actually just work right out of SketchUp because Revit imports so well into SketchUp. V-Ray, V-Ray does, it's great for, just getting started with rendering, but then also it has a robust enough engine that it can handle, really heavy projects. And if you're not familiar with how a visualization company works, what happens is architects or developers, they will send us a project either, in this case it was a Revit file that we brought into SketchUp, we cleaned it up a little bit, threw some textures on it, rendered it out in V-Ray. We don't spend too much time in the 3D world or in texturing, but we try to get a decent looking base image, and then from there we go into Photoshop and just kind of Photoshop the crap out of it. And so like we're replacing the ground plane, we're adding in vegetation and people and trees and kind of the lighting and the atmosphere. And there's, it can last a week, it can last 2 weeks. It really depends on how much of an iterative process it is with the clients. One of the biggest changes from doing this for fun on my website to doing this professionally is things get a lot more complex. And so I don't even have all the groups expanded in this, but this is like one of the images where we're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of layers. And so it becomes very important to manage your layers and name everything properly and mask it properly, because we're always making changes. We're always updating base files. All of our base files now are smart objects, so when we kick out a new rendering, we just go in and update the smart files to kind of save us some time there. The other thing that is different is this idea of time. So like for this project, we had a client just calling us up, just begging us to do something in a matter of 2 days, and this is what they gave us. And typically we don't take on projects like this, but this was a really good client for us, and so we wanted to see what we could do. So they gave us this model, they gave us some precedent images and kind of some ideas that they had. And so the first day we just went in and we just modeled as fast as we could using components like crazy, because there's a lot of repeating objects in here, and textured it up, rendered it overnight. So we ended up with this base file the next morning, and then we P-shopped the crap out of it again, brought in people and trees, handed it off to the client. They were ecstatic, and then they said, just one more thing, the facade system's at the top, we don't like, can you switch that out? So then we took it back, and like in 20 minutes we just found something online and pasted it on, and they were happy, and that was great. This was another image for that project. So we did 2 images in 2 days. Again, that's not typical, but it's stuff that really wakes you up. You really don't need coffee when you're doing stuff like that. And then just scale of projects. So when we're doing this professionally, we get all kinds of stuff. And so this is a big project in Peru, I believe it was a university, and they sent us a 3D model. And we had to do quite a bit of modeling. We actually did all the lighting in Photoshop. We did use proxy trees and proxy cars and rendered those in, but the scale of these models can get pretty mammoth. And this is nothing compared to some of the other ones we've done, but right now they're not live to the public, so we can't talk about it right now. But this is another aerial. We're using more proxy trees and more proxy cars because we just can't Photoshop that much stuff when we're doing aerials. But then conversely, we're also doing very intimate spaces. This is, again, that project in Peru. This is a project in Boston. And this is the kind of stuff I love to do, because you kind of just get in and you try to develop. The client has this idea in their head, and you're trying to get as close as you can to it. And it's just a lot of playing with textures and light and entourage to kind of get that right feel of the image. Another project in Boston where the client wanted a daytime and a nighttime of the same image. And then this idea of understanding light. So when you're doing this professionally, you don't get a second chance. You have to get it right on the first time every time. So you really do have to have a good understanding of how light reacts. And in this case, we threw in a wet ground, so that kind of added a little bit more complications, especially when you're photoshopping in people. You now have to Photoshop in all the reflections, and if you Photoshop in light, you have to Photoshop in the light into the reflections, and same with the trees. So it's things get complicated pretty quickly, but you need to be able to react really fast and do what the client is asking you to do. And then this was a project in Istanbul, Turkey. Again, having to be comfortable with managing light. And then this is something we've been playing around with lately is, okay, 360 images, how much can you Photoshop something like this? Because there's so much distortion at the top and bottom. What can you get away with Photoshopping? And we realized we could do quite a bit of Photoshop. So, the base rendering didn't have any trees, people, the interiors weren't lit up. But we went in and just P-shopped the crap out of this one as well. This is kind of, this is like rendering 4 different images. I think this one was a little like 12,000 pixels wide, so it's just Photoshop file wise, it's huge. But what's nice is then now you can take that image, bring it into a 360-degree viewer, and you can actually experience a heavily photoshopped image. So this is something I want to play with a little bit more on the website, is like stuff like my cliff images and those really foggy atmospheric scenes. Like, what would it be like to Photoshop one of those and actually stand in there and look around and just kind of see everything. I mean, in the detail, like, right, exactly, because what's happening is when you're photoshopping over here, the shadows are going in one direction, and then as you're photoshopping over here, the shadows flip and go the other direction. So you constantly have to be aware of which direction shadows are going, what facade faces are getting hit with light. Let me escape out. Forget what it was called. Pano 2 VR. So this last thing I'm going to talk about is kind of, it's ironic that I'm talking about social life because I'm probably the most introverted person you're going to ever meet. There's a good chance I'm going to go up into my bedroom right after this talk and just curl up in a ball and just kind of hang out there for a little while. But for whatever reason, I'm running this website, so I've been trying to push my stuff out into the social world. And at the very beginning, this was not even something that was on the radar for me of like what to expect. I didn't ever expect this website to get as big as it did. But definitely didn't expect the community that kind of has evolved around this this website to happen. And so the idea of thousands of people critiquing my work every time I post an image, it's a little scary. And I get comments like Lucas here, who's basically saying this tutorial was a waste of time. And that stuff hurt pretty bad at the beginning, but after a certain while, you start to get a thick skin and you just ignore it. And what I realized is you can learn a lot by having so many people following you and kind of judging your work. So like on Facebook, an example of this is like I posted these 3 images, and the 2 images on the left just got a ton of response. People really started to, they were drawn to these images. And then the interior shots on the right, I was pretty excited about these. I thought these were pretty cool images. I post them and just no response. Just people, I mean, nothing like the first 2 images. And that kind of changed the way I thought about illustration, because I thought people were more interested in just going with the photorealistic stuff. I thought that's what people were really interested in. But more and more that I do this, I realize people are just interested in the unique, the different. And so like images like that on the left are a little bit more unique, a little bit more atmospheric, and people react to that a little bit more. And I just started an Instagram account several months ago. And again, I posted these 2 images, and the one on the top, for some reason, just blew up, and my phone for 2 weeks straight was just coming up with notifications, whereas the one on the bottom, almost no reaction to it. So it's really interesting to see, how the community responds to this, and it's been honestly one of the things now that as I continue through the website that keeps the motivation alive is this community that responding and communicating back and forth with them. It's something that keeps the motivation alive. So it's been a good experience. Thank you.